Welcome back, Rafa, to our next episode and edition of But What Does It Mean? Our new podcast. I'm delighted to be back, and we are also still on the topic of Iran. The leader of the free world has recently, over the Easter weekend, been threatening Iran with its entire extinction, talking about bombarding bridges and civilian infrastructure, and no doubt to any expert this would have amounted to war crimes. Then he tackled Trump always chickens out last minute. We did, luckily for us, luckily for the world, and mostly for the people of Iran. But the question that not only a few ask themselves now, is Donald Trump still in a sound mind? What do we make of this tirade that he has eschewed over Easter? Like former acolytes like Tucker Carlson were saying this man is mad, and he was urging the military to not follow illegal orders by Trump. So what do you make of the situation?
Alex, it's good to be here again. Thank you for that. Well, that's quite a start. As I say, there are a number of points to look at. I think the first thing, perhaps, is that with respect to what happened last night in particular, you and I had talked about this previously, that this is a president who, for many people, came to their attention first as a reality TV star. And what we saw perhaps in the run-up to yesterday was very much a reality TV cliffhanger, very much the idea of, wow, we've all got to watch what's going to happen at 8 o'clock Eastern time. And lo and behold, I'm happy to report, thanks, it seems, to a large part played by the country of my birth, the Prime Minister, as well as the President Trump's favorite Field Marshal, that the proposal put forward, the President Trump, that is, decided that he really was happy to pull back and give himself and the Iranians 2 weeks to find a solution. From what we understand and what we've been reading, there is clearly a lot of conversations going on in the background, including we hear today, according to the New York Times, even the Chinese, which is to many people would be a surprise, getting involved by way of pushing Iran to accepting that this is the right thing to do right now. But I think if we move on from the fact that whether it was a taco situation or whether it was a question of reality setting in, much as we talked about last time, so what is the purpose of all of this? I think to the dispassionate observer, and we would perhaps count ourselves in that the actions of the Americans, of President Trump and his Israeli allies, particularly over the last couple of weeks, have become more and more baffling, that it really was not clear what was the end game. It's been relatively clear, I think, from the events of June last year, but even through to the first couple of weeks of this war, that yes, Iran had some ballistic missile, drone capability of fighting back, and obviously the bulk of that has been the effect of that has been borne by the GCC states around it. But there was no real fight here, and so simply to go on battering day after day the infrastructure, unless you were going to take Harg Island, with all the implications that we've seen with regards to oil prices and what was going on, I think that was going to be quite hard. And I think this has really it's given everybody what's nowadays called an off-ramp, that both for the US and its immediate ally, as well as for the Iranians, to step back. If there are conversations that are going on with regards to some sort of a deal, which seems to be acceptable to both sides, then this is fantastically a good development for both countries involved, certainly the Iranian people, and for the world as a whole. I think going on to whether President Trump is, as some have alluded, certainly over the weekend, or commented whether he's fit for office, whether there are issues in relation to his mental capacity. This is very, very highly subjective, and I guess it's a very politically barbed question. But again, as observers, I think one would have to say that this is clearly something which, first and foremost, it's a matter for the American people to decide. But
That would I actually like to have a look at that, because the repercussions, reverberations within the United States. Like, back to Tucker Carlson, who was like appalled, as he said, by the Easter statement of the President of the United States, where he also seemed to have made a mockery of Muslim faith. It's also like not been a Christian message at all for this very holiday. So what do you make of this scenario that when he says like the U.S. military should not follow Donald Trump's orders if they are illegal under the U.S. Constitution and international law? Would that be like put the country at the brink of a civil war?
I think that's a very, very difficult question to address, simply because if you're a soldier, first and foremost, all soldiers, most well-disciplined soldiers, are taught that there is a uniform, there's a code of command, a command chain that you follow, and through that process, that if you're told by your commanding officer to jump, the question is not shall I or shan't I, but how high do I jump? I think that is one which is really very difficult. If you're particularly in a battlefield situation, you are going to be trained. What is illegal, not illegal? Are you sitting there? Shall I fire my gun, or do I search ChatGPT to understand what is the definition of an illegal order? I think it's. I would be very, very surprised if during an active combat situation you were to find that senior commanders were taking a view that they would disobey those kind of orders. I think the place for that is in debate.
Yeah, and also ultimately it did not come through. The president did, luckily, and thanks to God, not be following through with his threats of war crimes. And some would argue that like a civil war, if it would happen today, would not one being on a battlefield within the United States as it used to be from 1862 to 65. It would be more one in the courts. And that's a very interesting view to take, because President Trump has, of course, been pushing the accepted boundaries of presidential power more than once. He has sidelined Congress more than once. So you could argue, oh yeah, there is already like this battle underway. And before the Easter holidays, there were around 8 to 9 million Americans on the streets in the No Kings marches. And according to the theory of Erica Chansworth, a Harvard political scientist, if you have around 3.5% of a population on the street, that would ultimately mean the end of any authoritarian leader. She has examined, I believe, from 1906 to 2006, all the cases of violent and non-violent uprisings. So we're almost at 3% of people protesting in the United States. And if you believe in science, or at least getting hints and clues from there. So are we like in the midst of a situation of regime change in the United States and not in Iran?
Well, that would be ironic, wouldn't it? A regime change in the United States, but not in Iran. I think that we're a long way away from that. The constitutional reality is that it is almost impossible to talk about a regime change in the way that you're talking about at the moment, Alex. I think that would be very difficult. The U.S., and the topic for another day, but the U.S. electoral system, how you would go through this process, would certainly be very much, it makes it very difficult to just simply come out on the streets and overthrow a sitting president.
We have a midterm election coming up.
But that would be the way that perhaps people can express their displeasure with the way that the President Trump's second term is going. But don't forget, look, the Supreme Court has shown, particularly with the decision around tariffs and a couple of other recent decisions, that it's not an absolute given that it will vote only one way. And I think that's probably come as a bit of a surprise to some within the inner circle of President Trump. So there remains some hope that the checks and balances in the system can and do still work. And I think that's very important. But you're right, if you have people out on the streets in the kind of numbers you're talking about, one could be cynical and say that yes, but are they in the states which are swing states? If they're all coming out on the streets of New York or in the streets of California, it's not going to make any difference to the democratic process in the sense of changing the sitting senators in states, or ultimately getting the votes that are required through the Electoral College to change the presidencies. I mean, I'm going off at a complete tangent, but the point is you can have millions of people. You could have, as you said, what is a very statistically very important number of the population out on the streets. But at the same time, does that really mean regime change in the sense of, yes, I think we will certainly get most political scientists and those who are much better informed about the subject than I am, but who would say that the Democratic Party will win the House of Representatives in the midterms, with a very strong chance that the Senate could go. But that's probably a little bit more balanced. But how that would play out in 2028, one could again somewhat cheekily say depends on who the candidate is, right?
Absolutely, yes, indeed. Yeah.
And at the moment there is still some uncertainty, despite all the assurances to the country from some quarters, whether there would be a third President Trump term coming up or not. But I think at the moment we're looking really at a situation where the numbers of people are clearly upset. They want to express a view. But whether that leads to the kind of change that you're talking about, Alex, I think that would be, yes, in the near term, almost certainly. It will result in some fundamental change in terms of the makeup of Washington. But whether that leads to the longer term electoral changes or the swings, I think that is still to the...
When you see like that, Trump still has quite some support in his own domain. I mean, albeit it's like reduced and like decreasing. There's still like the popularity overall is the lowest on record, I believe. But I think the moment like Americans who are in his camp feel like the repercussions in terms of like at the gas station and rising costs, this might be like a instigating a change for the midterms. But like looking into effects and ripple effects of this war, looking back in the region, into the Persian Gulf, we also happen to have lots of friends. Like, what do they tell you? Like, how do they feel? How are the Gulf countries doing? Actually, I'm not sure if we're getting the full picture here when we look into our media, because it's so concerned with like the real battlefield situation that they might just fall short on reporting fully on the rest of the region.
I think we noted in our first podcast, Alex, if you remember, that the reality is, in terms of truth being the first victim of a war, particularly with all the social media that we have today. And this is coupled with the fact that other than Al Jazeera to a very small extent, none of the mainstream media have a presence in Iran, and what is going on we don't really know. But with respect to your question as to what does this mean from the Gulf states, it's clear that the Gulf states are very keen to try as much as possible to paint a picture of, look, there are missiles and drones coming over, but relatively speaking, they've had a very high success rate in terms of dealing with them. Yes, it does shatter a little bit the myth of safe havens, but as we've discussed this last time, that I do not believe this will be a long-term dampener on both investment flows and human flows into the GCC as a region. Yes, it's come as a real surprise to some people that actually Iran is next door, and yes, they might face a few missiles and drones coming their way. But the reality is that, yes, it is. I mean, I think I saw something this morning which said that of almost of 240,000 British expats living in the UAE, that apparently some 40-odd thousand have left in the last few weeks, primarily to come back into the UK, but to sit out the period of the war. Will they go back? I think that I would believe the vast majority of them will go back, because that decision to go there was never one that you made so easily. And you're only back here because you're naturally worried about your children and your wife and yourself in terms of what might happen. But I think that, coupled with the fact that anecdotally, if one talks to friends in the financial services businesses in Singapore, in Switzerland, that the flows of money out of the Gulf have been nowhere near the kind of numbers that have been hinted at or perhaps alluded to mass panic of movement of people. I think the vast majority of people recognize that these are hopefully a temporary situation. Yes, they'll have to make a reassessment based on whatever kind of peace deal, if you like, is eventually made. But the reality is that there are clearly there are more missiles, there are more drones flying across some of the neighboring states than perhaps we are being led to believe. But I'm not sure if that's necessarily such a bad thing. At least it dampens panic, it dampens the concern of family members that are away from the region. They're not calling you up every day and saying, hey, get out of there, get out of there. At least you can make perhaps a more rational decision in terms of what you're doing. It's not great, but I believe that the GCC states on the whole have shown that what they represent, and those that are there and have put assets there in terms of financial assets have done so on a considered basis, and I think the money, the assets are not going to move very quickly, and they've shown very little inclination to move. Some certainly have, but nothing like the kind of numbers that have been hinted at. And at the same time, yes, some people have left, those that could, but they will be back. And if anything, I would imagine that there'll be the growth that was predicted for that part of the world will continue, will recover substantially after this crisis is over.
The Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu said that the ceasefire does explicitly not apply to southern Lebanon, where his army is undertaking military action for a while now, culminating recently in the announcement that all Shia Muslims should be leaving southern Lebanon. That also would be amounting to ethnic cleansing. Also over the Easter holidays, Christian worshippers were not allowed in Israel into the holy sites of Christianity, which were very well protected under Ottoman rule, where Christians always had access to their holy sites. So these are in gravity, of course, different, but in when you look at all these events, Israel seems to be having its war aims in order. Greater Israel, that's the vision of Benjamin Netanyahu that has been reported also by the New York Times and other outlets who try to finagle and figure out how this war ultimately came to be. But when last time we also spoke about what are the aims of the war, we do not really know what Donald Trump's aims are, but we see what the Israeli leaders are. And now it's literally the question, what do we make with a country in the Middle East that has been heralded for a long time to being the only democracy in the Middle East, and now it's such a warring party that it seems to be not even that the United States could rein into what is a break of international law.
I think there's, Alex, with respect to your last comment, I think that we're all, at least those that are looking at this dispassionately, have no real dispute with respect to the violations of international law. The question really is, in the current climate, if you accept that 1945 to 2015 were the exception, that relative peace, Pax Americana, globalization, the world becoming one great big melting pot, as the song said many years ago, we would get lots of coffee-colored people coming out the other end. All of that has, to some extent, come and gone. And we were talking about what is the new reality today. The fact that the Vice President of the United States is actively politically campaigning in Hungary.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had the reverse, in fact, it's ironic because at some level, if you remember, the Labour Party during the early stages of the last election campaign in the United States was accused of interfering in the election process in the US because they sent over a number of people to, I guess, help volunteers to help with the Kamala Harris campaign and a few others. And we had people who were visas were cancelled, deported from the country and told they were interfering with the election. Yet here is the Vice President of the United States of America making it pretty clear what he's doing in Hungary at the moment. So look, that's, as I said, the world has moved on. The new reality that we operate under has changed. But the idea of Greater Israel, again, we touched upon this before. Look, how far can Israel go? How long can it sustain this kind of campaign? And what is the damage that it's doing to itself? Right? I mean, I would say that within reason, and I'm stretching this a little bit, most Arabs really don't care that much about Israel. It's there. It's a reality. Of course, there's certainly a significant number of people who may have a very negative view of the state of Israel, and perhaps it's even its right to exist. But let's assume most people live and let live.
And normalization was on its way.
And normalization was. You've seen the Abraham Accords. You've seen, obviously, in fact, ironically, a country like the UAE, in particular, going quite a long way, not just in terms of normalization relationships, but actively making very significant investments into Israel within the tech sector in particular. So how long can they sustain this kind of campaign? How long can you, and how far can you stretch those borders? Southern Lebanon, pushing out the Shias, keeping Christians out of holy sites. This just seems just so. Why? The question is, at least keep with respect to the holy sites. You get into a very, very interesting domain situation, and there are. I'm aware of at least one or two other disputed disputes that are ongoing right now, which are approaching, I think, facing under international arbitration, where Israel has a particular view about the ownership of certain of those sites. They've been long-term held in trusts, and there's a whole bunch of other things that are going on, and that's, I would have thought, unsettling. And as you said, not what you would associate with the so-called the one democratic state in that part of the world. How can you be carry that label and yet be seen to be doing things which are very undemocratic? The issue of Greater Israel, I mean, as if one would take Mike Huckabee in his recent interview and what he alluded to, I mean, I think that is that's completely unrealistic. I mean, that would require a commitment, not just in terms of financial resources, but in terms of human resources, that I think even Prime Minister Netanyahu would argue that is probably a little beyond the state of Israel for now and probably the foreseeable future. But I do not believe that expansion of their borders can carry on like this without it taking a very significant toll on the economy of the country. And to maintain those borders, if you like, at least for the next 5-10 years, so that you have some degree of permanence, is going to require a level of mobilization of forces and economic and a cost that, as I said, is very hard to see how that's going to be recouped or where that comes from.
To conclude today's episode, we have been talking about this in the very beginning about China, and I find it very interesting that we will be learning more and more about China's involvement in reaching the ceasefire now between Israel, the US, and Iran. And the reports now say that China has asked the Iranians into the ceasefire, and we might be talking a little about the reasons, but also about this is, in my knowledge, the first time China, except for calling something out but not doing much about it. Now it's the first time that it seems that China has literally put the levers and put their diplomatic weight behind an issue. They did not do this with Gaza, even though they are an advocate of the Palestinians. They have been siding with the Kremlin, but giving the impression of being neutral. So here it seems like that China has been, maybe with the help of your birth country, Pakistan, being pushed into a certain direction, which would be a novum, wouldn't it?
It would. This week's edition of The Economist has the headline on the front page, which says, "Don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake." And obviously China, we talked about this before, China has very smartly just sat this out. Yet it is clearly directly impacted by what's happening, given the very significant quantities of Iranian oil that China purchases. The official number is 20%, but there's talk that it could be maybe even as high as double that number, given that some of the sanctions type issues. So, yes, it's interesting that China has made this move, but probably not so surprising given how obviously it directly impacts what's going on. I mean, you could argue that Ukraine, what real impact does it have on China per se? Gaza, obviously a terrible tragedy, but how does that impact China? Here, very significant amounts of China, the Chinese economy runs on Iranian oil, and therefore asking them to intervene using the goodwill that they have, albeit with some persuasion from the country of my birth. So that it is, I think it very much reflects the way that China would behave. Nothing overt, but just quietly behind the scenes and saying, guys, I think this is an opportunity for you to step back from the complete brink, because the guy in the White House is capable of anything, and before it gets to complete destruction of a civilization, as President Trump put it, let's call a halt and step back and hopefully find a way we can move on from here.
Thank you so very much, Rafat, for your insights on this episode of But What Does It Mean? We strive so many things, the midterms in the United States, whose outcome will, of course, determine whether or not and to what degree the Trump administration will be able and continue to shake up the international world order. We looked into Israel, who we also wondered how far they can go and how long to push a perceived vision of a greater Israel. And ultimately, we also looked into Iran and like China and Pakistan helping like the brokering the ceasefire that's now in effect. Thank you so much, Rafat, and I'm looking already forward to our next episode.
Thank you, Alex, and I too look forward to our next episode.